In this lesson, I'm going to demonstrate the concept of lists and also why they're used, what are lists, how do we use them in Python. So what is a list in Python? Python has a great built-in list type named list. List intervals are written with square brackets. So typically we've been using parentheses for our definition functions and so on. But for lists, we use square brackets. So this is an important difference. So anytime within your Python code you see a bracket, for instance, that means it'll be a list. And the concept of lists are related to arrays of programming languages like C, C++, or Java. But in Python, lists are by far more flexible and powerful than your classical set of arrays. Generally speaking, a list is a collection of objects. And to be more precise, a list within Python is an ordered group of items or elements. So it's like creating a list of grocery items, for instance, or a list of cities, a list of states, and so on. Lists can also be an arbitrary mixture of elements like numbers, strings, other lists, and so on. In other words, we can embed lists within other lists, and they can contain both numbers as well as text or strings. The list type is essential for Python scripts and programs. This means that you will hardly find any serious Python code without a list. So they're very important, very common, and a powerful element in Python. Here's some of the main properties of lists. So whenever we start working with lists in Python, we need to make sure that we understand certain properties. First, that they're ordered. In other words, they're one after the other, right? Separated by commas. Second, they contain arbitrary objects, numbers, strings. Elements of a list can be accessed by an index, so you can search your list, in other words. They are arbitrarily nestable, which means that they can contain other lists as sublists. So you can create a list, and then you can create a list within a list, and so on. And finally, they are mutable. In other words, the elements of a list can be changed. You can add items to a list, you can delete items from a list, you can append items to a list, and so forth. So here are some of the basic properties. Here's some of the list notations. For instance, a list always starts with brackets, right? So you start with the opening bracket, then you enter your items within the bracket, and then you close your brackets. If there's nothing in the list, then an empty list would simply signify a set of brackets. Then we can have integers, 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on. You can have strings, you can have floating numbers, you can have list of strings, you can have a nested list, and you can have multiple lists nested. Alright, so once we know the concept of lists, let's get into how do we assign list to a variable. Okay? Simple assignment statement that we can create using a list. For instance, here's an example like languages equals, and then you start with your bracket, and then you list out items basically. So it's Python and C, C++, Java, Perl. These are all strings. The second example is list 1, which contains physics, chemistry, both integers and strings. And list 2 is once again purely numbers, and list 3 is strings once again. So let me in fact demonstrate. Let's go ahead and create a list. So creating lists is just like assigning a value to a variable, right? So you create a variable like list 5 equals, and then you start your brackets, and then you can type, of course, since it's a string, so you need your quotations, and we can say something like red, green, blue, orange, and so on. So you get the idea, right? So here's our basic list. You end your list with a set of brackets, and you've just created a list. So if I say something like print list 5, Python is going to print the output or the complete list. So just a basic idea, and we've been doing this before, assigning variables, right? Simple assignment statement. So here you can take the entire list and assign a variable to the list itself. So once you have the list created, how do we in fact access values in the list? Let's say you have a list of 100 items or 1,000 items. You're running an e-commerce website and you have thousands and thousands of products. In other words, your lists are huge. So how do we access values within the lists? Let me in fact demonstrate this. So I'm going to click on File, open up my shell editor here, and we are going to create a list and then try to access values within that particular list. Of course, I'm going to start with a comment. This is how you would create a list. Okay, you start off by assigning a variable, declaring a variable. Here's list 1, for instance, and the values within this list are, let's say, well, physics, list of courses, I guess, chemistry, biology, history, or let's add one more subject here, and we're going to say psychology. Okay, great. Let me expand that. So here's a list 1. Let's create another one. Here's list 2 equals, and here we're just going to say 1, 2. We're going to put integers within this list. So let's say, assume that these lists are huge, right? So we have a bunch of subjects and we have list 2, which contains several numbers. So here we can first simply print the entire list, which I demonstrated earlier. But what if you have to fish out certain information from the list? In other words, specify or display as a result or an output biology class, right? In other words, how does Python know? How would you tell Python to simply list out the bio class? Well, recall from one of our earlier lessons, the way Python works is it assigns values, arbitrary values to the list, right? Like, for example, physics would be a 0, chemistry would be a 1, bio would be a 2, history would be a 3, and psychology would be a 4, and so on. And the same is true for negative indices, right? So counting backwards, would be -5, -4, 3, 2, and -1. So that way you can tell Python to print a certain element out of the list. So for instance, if I say print, all right, let's say list 1, and I like to print the, let's say, the number 3. I want to know what's third on the list. And let's continue on. I want to search for another one within the same list. And within the same list, I'm going to say, give me the value of 4. Close my parentheses. All right, great. Let's see what happens when I run this. So click on run, run module. Of course, save the module first. And I'm going to go to my Pythons folder within the data files here. And I'm going to call it my list. And what Python does, it displays history and psychology. In other words, the list item number 3 within the list is history. So once again, it's 0 for physics, 1 for chemistry, 2 for biology, and 3 for history. That's why history was printed as number 3 on the list. And of course, 4 is psychology. So keep this in mind when you're creating lists once again. Similarly, I can do the same for, let's say, list 2. I can say list 2. I can also do an array, right? A range of values. For instance, let's say within list 2 here, I like to find out everything that's between 1 and 2 ranges. And also within the same list, I'm interested in looking at 1 to 5. Okay, just as an example. Let's run this again. Run module, of course, save, click OK. And here's the results. Of course, we get our history and psychology as our first print statement here. And then the second one, what Python does, it fishes out information from list 2, gives me the respective values within the range. So lists are a very powerful way of working, and when you're working with lists, the sky's the limit. So based on your own requirements, you can create multiple lists. Here are some of the basic list operations. So not only list provides us a valuable way of grouping items together and accessing information from the list, we can also run different operators within the list. In other words, we can add two lists together, we can add values together, we can multiply lists, concatenate, and so on. So let me in fact demonstrate this as well. Let me bring up my shell one more time. So here, let's say I'm going to click on File, a new file, close the previous one. Here we're going to create some code and then take a look at how Python allows us to manipulate lists. All right, great. So here's my comment here, using operators in lists. Great, so just quickly create some lists here. How about list 1 equals, and let's say I'm going to mix and match this time around. I'm going to say some numbers and some text or strings. Chicago, just listing out some cities here. Boston, and I'm going to say New Jersey, and one more. How about Austin? Okay, so here's our first list, and similarly, I'm going to quickly create a list 2 here, and this one also is going to have, let's say, some numbers, 4, 5, 6, and some text strings. I'm just going to make something up here. ABC, XYZ, and let's say one more. EFG, or you get the idea, right? So we can mix and match strings and numbers as well. Okay, so I have two lists here, simple lists. If I were to say something like print, and what I'm going to do is show you how we can use, for instance, some of these operators, right? So let me show you these operators again. For example, one of the operators is the length, right? So if I need to know the length of my list or the items within my list, I can use the len function, right? So within my print, once I have my two lists created, I can tell Python to tell me the lengths, for example. So here I'm going to say first list length, and of course use a colon, and now I'm going to use my length function, right? So it's len and then simply my list 1. Okay, so I like to find out the length of list 1 and close the parentheses again because I used the first parentheses for the print. Okay, same thing. I'm going to do another one, and this is going to be the second list length, and use the same function, len list 2. Great. Let's see what happens when I run this module. So click on run module, click OK to save, and I'm going to call it list length and click save. So Python automatically tells me that my first list length is 5. In other words, there are 5 values within this list. So we can use the len function and it will give us the length of the list. Of course, we can also add two lists together or concatenate. Remember the plus sign. So let's say I'm going to use the same code here instead of creating a new one. Just add the two lists together. So I'm going to say print, and this is pretty straightforward. I'm going to say list 1 and then plus list 2. Okay, let's run the module again. Click on run module, OK to save, and the output is displayed. So Python is going to add two lists and display it in a single output. So 1, 2, 3, Chicago, Boston, New Jersey, Austin. 4, 5, 6, ABC, and so on. So all I did here was use the plus operator, and Python combined the two lists together. And of course, as the last example here, we can always multiply or use any operands, right? As far as your lists are concerned. So I can say something like print list1, and let's say if I like to repeat, so I can say multiply or the asterisk sign times 5. Okay, let's run the module again. See the output, run module, click OK to save, and notice this time Python repeats list1 5 times. So list is a powerful way to be used in Python, and we will use this almost every single time when we're creating code. You need a list of items, and then you can manipulate that list based on your own requirements or the program that you're writing. So practice using lists, and let's move to our next lesson.